You probably know me as mathematics, but forget what you learned in the classroom. My story, my real story, doesn't start in a textbook. It kicks off in the mud, in the blistering heat, right in the middle of the life-giving chaos of an ancient river. You see, I wasn't born from some abstract idea. I was born because people desperately needed me to survive.
You've got to understand, for the ancient Egyptians, this was everything. The Nile River, it was their god and their demon, all rolled into one. It could bless them with a harvest that would feed everyone, or it could just as easily rise up and violently sweep their entire world away. They were living quite literally on a razor's edge, completely at its mercy.
So, caught in that yearly spin cycle of hope and total chaos, humanity needed a way to find some order, some tool to make sense of it all. And that fundamental need, well, that's what gave birth to me. And what's really wild is just how thin that line was. The difference between a famine that could wipe out thousands and a harvest that could feed their whole civilization, it was just a few cubits of water. Predicting that flood wasn't just a neat trick. Their very survival hung in the balance.
But before they could even think about predicting the future, they had a much bigger, more immediate problem on their hands. You see, the same flood that dropped off all that amazing, life-giving silt also washed away every single line that defined their world. Seriously, just try to imagine that. Every year, every single boundary marker for every farm, every property line, poof, just gone, swallowed by the river. This was way more than an inconvenience. It threatened to tear their whole society apart. They had to find a reliable, totally fair way to redraw their world, or they'd face constant conflict. And so, my first followers, my first disciples, they weren't scholars in quiet rooms. They were these incredibly practical guys out in the sun-baked fields. The Greeks later gave them a name, Harpedonoptai. It literally means rope stretchers. And with that simple tool, a rope, they started to tap into my power.
And this was my first real gift to them. Geometry. The word itself just means earth measurement. And get this, they figured out that a simple rope with 12 knots, tied at equal spaces, could be pulled into a 3-4-5 triangle. And that corner opposite the longest side? Boom! A perfect 90-degree angle, every single time. This was an eternal truth they could hold in their hands, a way to put their world back together, fairly and precisely, year after year.
Okay, so the land is sorted out. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. Now that the land was divided, the food from that land, the grain, the bread, it had to be shared too. And this kicked off a whole new challenge. How do you divide things up so that everyone agrees it's fair?
So let me ask you, put yourself in their shoes. This isn't some abstract problem. You have 7 loaves of bread and 10 hungry people staring at you. It's about making sure every single one of them feels like they got a fair shake. So, what's your move? How do you do it? Now, I know what you're thinking. Easy. 7 divided by 10 is 7/10. But the Egyptians, they thought about it completely differently. Their whole system was built on unit fractions. Fractions with a 1 on top. So to them, 7 divided by 10 wasn't 7/10. It was 1/2 plus 1/5. It sounds kind of weird to us now, but it was actually brilliant. Here's how it worked in the real world. You take 5 of those loaves and you slice each one in half. That gives you 10 half-loaf pieces. Perfect, 1 for each person. Then you take the last 2 loaves and cut each one into 5 little pieces. Now you have 10 fifth-loaf pieces. So every single person gets a half-loaf and a fifth loaf. It's a physical solution that everyone can see with their own eyes is totally equal. I wasn't just a tool for calculating, I was becoming the language of fairness itself.
So, with people fed and society more or less in order, something new started to bubble up. Ambition. Humans weren't just content to survive anymore. Now, they wanted to build things that would defy time itself, things that would reach for the heavens. And for this, their greatest test yet, they called on me again. If you want just one number, one single fact, to grasp the insane precision they were after, this is it. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, it is aligned to true north with an error of less than 0.05 of a degree. That is just unbelievably accurate. That's not luck. That is pure high-level calculation, using the stars and math to point a mound of stone. And hey, that was just lining it up. They used me for everything. Calculating the volume of over 2 million massive stone blocks, making sure the slope was exactly the same on all 4 sides, leveling that enormous foundation with, of all things, channels of water. Not to mention managing the mind-boggling logistics of it all. The pyramids aren't just incredible buildings. They are some of the greatest mathematical symphonies ever composed.
But all of this, the perfect fields, the fairly seared bread, even those awe-inspiring pyramids, it was all, in a way, practice for the main event. It all comes back to my true purpose in their world, solving the one problem that started everything. It was time to finally tame the Nile.
This didn't happen overnight. It all started with incredible patience. For generation after generation, priests would stand on the stone steps of the Nilometers, and they would just watch and observe. And then they took the step that changed everything. They started to write it down. Every measurement, every mark on the column was carefully recorded on papyrus. They were taking the raw, chaotic power of nature and turning it into something structured. They were turning it into data.
And once I had all those numbers to work with, something truly amazing started to happen. Looking at these long lists, they began to see it, a hidden rhythm in the river's madness, cycles that repeated over decades, patterns that linked the rains hundreds of miles away to the flood right at their feet.
And then came the payoff, the culmination of centuries of watching and recording. That priest on the steps, he wasn't just a passive observer anymore. When he looked at the water level, he was seeing what was to come. He was using me to turn chaos into predictable abundance, and in doing so, he was guaranteeing the future of his entire civilization.
So for the Egyptians, I was the ultimate how-to manual. How to divide a field, how to share bread, how to build a pyramid, how to predict a flood. But all of that work, all that practical genius, leads to a fascinating question, one that sets up the next chapter of my story. What happens when a new civilization comes along, and they start using me not just to figure out how things work, but to ask the much deeper question, why?